A torpedo that ignores everything you throw at it. No noisemaker fools it. No decoy works. It doesn't hunt your engines. It doesn't track your hull. It follows the one thing a ship can never hide. The churning, turbulent trail of white water left behind every second you're moving. That's a wake-homing torpedo. Right now, in this scenario, one is in the water behind an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer somewhere in the Western Pacific, closing at roughly 50 knots. The clock is already running. The question isn't whether the crew knows it's coming. The question is whether the geometry works in their favor before that weapon runs out of water to cross. Stay with us. The answer lives in the physics. And in a set of layered responses, the US Navy has spent decades building for exactly this moment. Let's build the threat first, because you can't understand the defense until you understand what makes this weapon so hard to face. Most anti-ship torpedoes are acoustic. They listen. They track the cavitation noise of your propellers, the low-frequency rumble of your machinery, and they home in on sound. That has a natural counter. Flood the water with noise from another direction. Deploy a towed decoy like the AN/SLQ-25 Nixie. Draw the weapon off course. Acoustic homing is a known problem with known solutions, and the US Navy has practiced against it for generations. A wake homer is different. It doesn't listen. It feels. Specifically, it reads the density discontinuity, the turbulent, aerated column of disturbed water a ship's hull and propellers leave behind. That wake persists. Depending on sea state and ship speed, a destroyer's wake can be detectable by a sensor array for several minutes after the ship has passed. The torpedo launches from a submarine, possibly a Type 039A or Type 039B, the latest People's Liberation Army Navy diesel-electric boats operating in the South China Sea and Western Pacific, crosses the open water until it intercepts the wake, then rides that trail back toward its source. Physics, not electronics. The water tells it where to go. That's the design logic. And here's what makes it uncomfortable. The Nixie, one of the core tools in the destroyer's acoustic defense kit, does very little against it. The decoy generates noise. The torpedo doesn't care about noise. The weapon runs at somewhere between 45 and 55 knots, depending on variant. And Arleigh Burke at flank speed tops out around 31 knots. The geometry favors the torpedo, and throwing sound at it changes nothing. So, you have a weapon that ignores your primary decoy, outruns you, and steers by reading a trail your ship cannot stop creating. What does the US Navy actually do? Let's put a ship in the water. An Arleigh Burke Flight 3A destroyer, roughly 9,000 tons of displacement, a crew of around 300, equipped with the AN/SPY-1D phased array radar, the Aegis combat management system, hull-mounted sonar AN/SQS-53C, and a TB-37 multifunction towed array trailing behind the hull. The ship is transiting the Western Pacific at around 18 knots, well inside the regime where a wake is clearly formed and readable. Somewhere off the bearing, the tactical picture has been uncertain for the last 40 minutes. Not a confirmed contact. Not a lost one, just uncertain. That uncertainty is the opening the threat exploits. The sonar supervisor in the Combat Information Center has been watching a faint narrowband trace on the TB-37 display for the better part of an hour. Not enough to call a contact. Enough to keep watching. The trace is consistent with a diesel-electric submarine running on battery power. Quiet, slow, disciplined. The kind of contact that stays ambiguous right up until it decides not to be. The watch officer logged it. The commanding officer was notified. The ship kept transiting, because an uncertain trace in a busy shipping lane isn't sufficient grounds to break off a scheduled transit. That judgment call, keep moving, is exactly what a threat environment is designed to exploit. At this moment, a Type 039B submarine, running quiet at periscope depth or just below, fires a wake-homing torpedo. The weapon clears the tube, arms, crosses the intervening distance, and finds the wake. The TB-37 towed array hears something first. Not the torpedo itself necessarily, but the transient of a torpedo tube firing, or the distinctive frequency signature of a high-speed propulsor running toward the ship. The array is trailing behind the ship, sensitive to exactly this kind of bearing. The sonar system classifies, the operator confirms, and the report goes up the chain in seconds. Inbound weapon, bearing, approximate range, closing speed. The Combat Information Center on the Arleigh Burke now has a problem with a shape, and the clock starts running in earnest. What the CIC knows, the torpedo is wake-homing. It found the ship's wake. It's now steering up that trail. At this moment, that trail points directly at the ship's stern. What the CIC also knows, the wake is not fixed. It's a physical object in the water, and a physical object can be manipulated. Here's the complication that recasts everything. The standard instinct when a torpedo is inbound is to run. Full power, maximum speed, get distance. Against an acoustic homer, that logic has some merit. You're buying your decoys time. You're opening the range. Against a wake homer, running full speed ahead is precisely the wrong move. It deepens your wake. It makes the trail stronger, more persistent, more readable. You're feeding the weapon the exact thing it needs to find you. The destroyer's own speed becomes a liability. This is where training breaks with instinct. And this is where U.S. Navy doctrine, built on years of exercises, analysis, and anti-torpedo workups, diverges sharply from what any untrained crew would do. The answer is not to run. The answer is to turn. Let's walk through the layered response, because this is what the U.S. Navy has actually developed, and the layers matter individually and together. Layer 1 is detection and classification. The AN/SQS 53C hull sonar and the TB37 towed array are feeding real-time data into the Aegis combat system, which runs track management on the inbound weapon. The system builds a firing solution, not just where the torpedo is, but where it will be, and at what point it intersects with the ship's projected position. That geometry drives the timing of everything that follows. If the sonar picture is clean and the classification is fast, the ship gains precious seconds. Seconds that, at 50 knots of closure, translate to hundreds of meters of working distance. What's most surprising about this sequence isn't the hardware. It's how little margin there actually is. From torpedo launch to the weapon finding the wake might be under 90 seconds in a close-range scenario. From wake acquisition to potential impact, depending on range, the window might be 3 to 4 minutes. The entire layered defense has to execute inside that envelope, with incomplete information, because in the real ocean, there's always something you don't know. Inside the CIC, the scene is controlled but compressed. The sonar operator who caught the launch transient is talking steadily into his headset, reading off bearing rate and frequency data while the fire control system builds its track. 3 other operators are cross-checking. One on the radar picture above the surface, one managing the towed array's narrowband display, one pulling up the threat library to confirm classification. The tactical action officer is already on the circuit to the bridge. Every second of that internal coordination is a second the torpedo is closing. The training that makes this work isn't about any individual piece of equipment. It's about the speed and discipline of the handoffs between people under conditions where a slow handoff is measured in hull plating. Layer 2 is the turn, and this is where the geometry gets interesting. The bridge, on order from CIC, initiates a hard turn, not a panic turn, a calculated one. The goal is to bend the ship's wake into a curve the torpedo's logic cannot cleanly follow. A wake-homing torpedo follows a gradient. It reads the density difference between wake water and ambient water and steers toward the peak of that gradient. When the ship is traveling in a straight line, that gradient points straight back at the ship. When the ship turns, hard, fast, sustained, the wake curves. The older portion of the wake, which the torpedo is currently riding, now points to a location where the ship no longer is. The gradient curves. The torpedo, following the gradient faithfully, curves with it. If the turn is sharp enough and sustained long enough, the torpedo rides the curve of the old wake away from the ship's new position. It doesn't know the ship moved. It knows the water. The specific turn geometry matters enormously. Too shallow, and the torpedo rides the curve and finds the ship anyway. Too sharp, done too fast, and the ship's new wake overlaps the old one, creating a crossing pattern the torpedo might reacquire. The doctrine calls for a specific combination of turn rate and sustained heading change, optimized through modeling and exercise, that maximizes the separation between where the ship is and where the torpedo thinks it's going. Put yourself in the tactical officer's position for a second. There's a weapon at your stern. Your instinct says go fast. The doctrine says turn. Your training says trust the geometry. And you have to make that call with a CIC full of people waiting on your order, a sonar trace updating every few seconds, and the knowledge that getting this wrong means a torpedo in your hull at 50 knots. That's the pressure the wake-homing torpedo creates. Not just physical danger, decision pressure. That's part of its strategic value. Layer 3 is the Nixie, and here its role shifts from primary defense to supporting element. The AN/SLQ-25A Nixie is a towed acoustic decoy. Against an acoustic homer, it's a frontline tool. Against a wake homer, it can't replicate a wake, but it still has a job. The Nixie, deployed during the turn sequence, adds noise and signature confusion to the tactical picture. If there's any acoustic component to the threat, if a follow-on weapon is acoustic rather than wake-homing, the Nixie is already in the water. And deploying it is part of the ship's standard threat response, signaling to the crew and the system that this is a full defensive evolution. Layer 4 is the hard kill option. The Arleigh Burke carries the Mark 54 lightweight torpedo in its Mark 32 surface vessel torpedo tubes, the SVTT system. The anti-torpedo concept, sometimes called a torpedo interceptor or hard kill countermeasure, puts a weapon in the water to intercept the inbound torpedo before it reaches the hull. This is not science fiction. The US Navy has been developing and testing anti-torpedo torpedo concepts for years. The physics are demanding. You're trying to guide a weapon to intercept another weapon running at high speed in a turbulent water column. But the concept is real, and the Arleigh Burke has the launch capability. In this scenario, the SVTT tubes put a Mark 54 or a dedicated countermeasure round into the water on a computed intercept bearing. The Aegis system feeds the firing solution. The weapon runs. Is this guaranteed to work? No. The intercept geometry for a wake-homing torpedo is genuinely difficult because the torpedo's path curves with the ship's old wake. The interceptor has to be fired at a projected intercept point that accounts for both the incoming weapon's current track and its likely deviation as the wake curves. That's a hard problem, but it's a solvable one, and the system is designed to take the shot. Here's the central question the US Navy has been working on for years, and the one that keeps showing up in wargaming. Can you reliably beat a wake-homer with maneuver alone, or do you need the hard kill? Honestly, you want both, but the turn is the foundation, and the hard kill is the insurance. If the turn works perfectly, the torpedo misses clean. If the turn works partially, the hard kill gets a shot. If the hard kill misses, the Nixie has potentially masked the ship's acoustic signature for any secondary search. The layers compound. No single system is the answer. The system is the answer. Layer 5 is the aviation element. The MH-60R Seahawk helicopter operating from the Arleigh Burke's flight deck is not a passenger. In this scenario, the helo was already airborne, either on an ongoing search pattern related to the earlier uncertain submarine contact or launched immediately on the torpedo alert. The MH-60R carries sonobuoys. Lots of them. The crew can drop a field of AN/SSQ 53 differ buoys in a pattern around the threat sector within minutes, boxing the area where the launch was detected and building an underwater picture the ship's own sonar can't see from its position. If the submarine is still in the area, if the Type 039B is repositioning after the shot, the sonobuoy field starts building a track. The MH-60R also carries Mark 54 torpedoes. If the submarine track resolves, the helo has a firing solution. The ship is no longer only defending, it is hunting. That shift changes the character of the engagement. A wake-homing torpedo forces a destroyer into a defensive posture. Turn, deploy, intercept. But the MH-60R overhead converts that defensive evolution into a two-sided problem for the submarine. Firing that torpedo revealed a position. The sonar field is now building around that position. The submarine that fired is now the one with a geometry problem. The crew of the MH-60R in this moment is flying low and fast. The acoustic processing equipment in the cabin running a real-time display of sonobuoy returns as each buoy splashes in and begins transmitting. The sensor operator in the back is calling out contacts and non-contacts in sequence, building the picture buoy by buoy. It's methodical work done quickly, with the knowledge that the submarine below, if it's still there, is listening to the same ocean and drawing its own conclusions about where the net is closing. A diesel-electric submarine like the Type 039B has one enormous advantage in this moment. It can go very quiet, cut its speed to near zero, and wait. The helo's job is to shrink the search area fast enough that waiting becomes untenable, going through open-source analysis on wake-homing torpedo engagements. The declassified after-action thinking from exercises like RIMPAC, the published work on anti-torpedo systems from NSWC Dahlgren. One detail keeps coming back. The single most important variable in this entire engagement is not the interceptor torpedo. It's not the helo. It's the time from wake acquisition to the bridge order to turn. If that gap is under 30 seconds, the ship's geometry at turn initiation is favorable. If it stretches past 60 seconds, due to classification uncertainty, reporting delay, or command hesitation, the window for a clean geometric solution starts closing fast. The entire billion-dollar defense architecture hinges on a 30-second human decision loop. That's what keeps the wake-homing torpedo relevant even against a fully equipped Arleigh Burke. Not because the defense doesn't exist, because the defense depends on speed of decision as much as it depends on hardware, and speed of decision is where training shows its value, or reveals its gaps. Here's what a successful defense looks like when all the layers work. The sonar operator classifies the inbound weapon at T-minus 3 minutes 30 seconds from estimated impact. The report takes 12 seconds to reach CIC. The tactical officer orders the turn at T-minus 3 minutes 15 seconds. The bridge initiates a hard port turn at maximum rudder. Simultaneously, the SVTT operator loads a firing solution and the Nixie operator deploys the towed decoy. At T-minus 2 minutes 45 seconds, the MH-60R receives the alert and begins dropping a sonobuoy pattern on the reported launch bearing. At T-minus 2 minutes, the SVTT fires a Mark 54 round on an intercept solution fed by the Aegis system. The torpedo runs. Meanwhile, the Arleigh Burke has completed roughly 90 degrees of turn. Its wake now curves sharply to port. The wake-homing torpedo, riding the trail, follows the curve, away from the ship's new heading. The older portion of the wake points into empty water. The torpedo follows it there. At T-minus 1 minute, the torpedo passes through the space the ship occupied 2 minutes ago. The ship is 700 meters off that point and continuing its turn. The interceptor round misses. The torpedo already deviated from its predicted track when the wake curved. But it doesn't matter. The geometry worked. The turn was enough. The torpedo runs out of wake to follow. It enters a search pattern. The terminal logic built into most wake-homers includes a lost track behavior, typically a sinusoidal search across the last known wake axis. It finds nothing. It runs to fuel exhaustion. The MH-60R, meanwhile, has a track on a contact at the launch bearing. A Type 039B submarine, having fired and now attempting to reposition below the layer. The sonobuoy field is building. The helo has a firing solution developing. The defensive evolution succeeded. The engagement is now on the Navy's terms. Here's the honest caveat, because this isn't a scenario where the arithmetic is always clean. The above worked because the timing was right, the sonar classification was clean, and the command decision was fast. Change one variable. A noisy sea state that obscures the torpedo launch transient, a sonar operator working a degraded array after 12 hours of continuous contact management, a commanding officer who hesitates 30 seconds longer, and the outcome changes. The wake-homing torpedo is not an unsolvable threat, but it's a weapon specifically engineered to stress exactly the parts of a ship's defense that are most time-critical and most dependent on human performance under pressure. Consider what that degraded picture actually looks like from inside the CIC. The sea state is a 3 to 4, moderate swells, enough surface noise to raise the detection threshold on the towed array by several decibels. The sonar operator has been on watch for 9 hours. The narrowband trace he's been watching for the last hour looked like biologics twice before he confirmed it as mechanical. Now something fast is in the water, and the first classification comes back ambiguous. High-speed propulsor bearing 275, but the frequency signature doesn't perfectly match the threat library entry for known wake-homer variants. Is it a torpedo? Is it a passing surface contact's machinery noise bouncing off a thermal layer? He calls it up the chain as a possible torpedo. The tactical action officer has to decide whether to execute the full defensive evolution on a possible. Wait for confirmation, and he loses 30 seconds of turn geometry. Act on a possible, and he's burned interceptor ordnance and broken formation on a false alarm. That exact moment of uncertainty under time pressure is what the weapon is engineered to create. The torpedo doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to make the defense hesitate. The cost comparison is also worth naming plainly. A wake-homing torpedo, variants in service with the Russian Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy, and others, costs somewhere in the range of $1 to $3 million depending on variant. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, fully fitted, costs over $2 billion. The interceptor torpedo it fires costs roughly $1 million. The MH-60R helicopter costs $30 million. The calculus of naval deterrence increasingly involves very expensive ships, spending very expensive ordnance to defeat relatively inexpensive weapons. And the side fielding the cheap weapon gets to pick when and where that exchange happens. That asymmetry is not a flaw in U.S. Navy planning. It's a known and accepted feature of the threat environment. What the U.S. Navy invests in is not the ability to make that exchange free. It's the ability to win it consistently and to make winning it automatic through training, doctrine, and layered systems that don't depend on any single perfect decision. Worth saying what a lot of defense commentary glosses over. The wake-homing torpedo deserves more attention than it gets precisely, because it forces an honest conversation about whether more decoys and better noise maskers are actually the right investment, or whether the answer is better maneuver doctrine, faster classification, and a credible hard kill round. The U.S. Navy has been moving toward the latter. The evidence is in the continued development of the anti-torpedo torpedo program and the emphasis in recent exercises on reducing decision latency at the CIC level. That's the right direction. But the investment isn't complete, and the threat isn't standing still. Here's what this tells us about where naval competition in the Western Pacific is actually heading. The Type 055 destroyer, the plan's most capable surface combatant, displacing over 12,000 tons and equipped with its own substantial sonar and anti-submarine suite. Operates in areas where U.S. destroyers transit. In any Western Pacific scenario, an Arleigh Burke doesn't face a torpedo in isolation. It faces a tactical picture that includes potential Type 055 coordination, J-20 fighters capable of anti-surface strike, DF-21D carrier-killer ballistic missiles designed to complicate the support picture, and, in the undersea dimension, a growing planned submarine force that includes Type 039B and Type 093 platforms operating with increasing proficiency and confidence in their own waters. The wakehoming torpedo is one layer of that threat architecture. It's the layer specifically designed to complicate the Arleigh Burke's defensive geometry, to force the ship into a defensive evolution that consumes time, consumes ordnance, and pulls the helo into a reactive posture rather than an offensive one. That forcing function has value for an adversary, even if the torpedo misses. A destroyer that just executed a full anti-torpedo evolution, burned fuel in hard turns, fired interceptors, dropped sonobuoys, is a destroyer that has revealed its position, consumed some of its defensive magazine, and spent crew attention and energy. Do that 3 times in an afternoon, and the ship's combat effectiveness degrades even without a hit. This is the logic that makes cheap, effective area denial weapons so valuable in a contested maritime environment. They don't have to sink the ship to win the equation. They have to complicate the ship's ability to be somewhere, doing something, at a specific time. The U.S. Navy's answer to that logic is not to pretend the threat doesn't exist. It's to build a force that can absorb the stress of those defensive evolutions, execute them reliably enough that the threat's forcing function stops working, and then go hunting. The MH-60R, turning the defensive evolution into a submarine hunt, is exactly that logic in practice. What this threat class reveals is something important about how naval competition has evolved. The most valuable investment an advanced Navy can make is often not bigger weapons or faster platforms, but reducing the time between detection and correct decision. The Arleigh Burke has the tools. The question the U.S. Navy keeps working on, the question that drives every exercise, every training workup, every CIC certification cycle, is whether the crew can use those tools fast enough. That's a human problem inside a technology answer, and it's the hardest kind to solve. So here's where this lands. A wakehoming torpedo is a genuine threat to an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, not because the defense doesn't exist, but because the defense requires everything to work in sequence, quickly, with a human decision loop at its center. The towed array classifies. The CIC acts. The bridge turns. The SVTT fires. The MH-60R hunts. When all of that happens inside the right time window, the physics work in the ship's favor, and the torpedo loses the trail it was built to follow. When any part of that sequence is slow, the margin disappears. The honest tension in this scenario isn't technology against technology. It's a billion-dollar platform designed for the full spectrum of naval warfare being forced into a very specific defensive geometry by a weapon that costs a fraction of one of its own interceptors. That's the design intent of the threat. And it's also the reason the U.S. Navy keeps investing in faster classification, harder kill countermeasures, and the kind of training that makes a 30-second decision window feel like a routine evolution rather than a crisis. Comment below, do you think the answer to wakehoming torpedoes is better decoys, tighter maneuver doctrine, or hunting the submarine before it ever fires? Because that argument is being had in real fleet planning right now, and there is no consensus. And if you want to see how the Arleigh Burke handles the other end of that threat spectrum, what happens when it faces not a single torpedo from below, but a coordinated anti-ship missile salvo from above? That breakdown is next.